Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is putting a ring on someone else's finger, promising to spend their entire life with them, in front of family, friends, sometimes hundreds of strangers, all wearing specific colors, following specific rituals, saying specific words that have been repeated almost unchanged for centuries. But have you ever stopped to wonder where any of this actually came from? Why a ring? Why on that finger? Why walk down an aisle? Why does someone give the bride away? None of this was randomly invented last week. Every single piece of a modern wedding has a strange, sometimes surprising, sometimes uncomfortable origin story. So let's go all the way back before flowers, before churches, before rings, to the very first moment something like marriage began. To understand marriage, we first have to understand what problem it was actually solving. Early humans, like many primates, likely lived in small groups where mating wasn't strictly paired off the way we think of marriage today. But something changed as human babies started being born more helpless and dependent for much longer periods than other animals. A human infant needs years of care before it can survive alone. That created enormous pressure on early human groups. Raising a child took serious time, energy, and protection. And so, anthropologists believe early pair bonding likely emerged not from romance, but from practical necessity. Two adults committing resources to raising offspring together simply produced better survival odds than raising children alone. This wasn't yet what we'd call marriage. There were no ceremonies, no vows, no rings. It was closer to a recognized social arrangement, a signal to the rest of the group that these two people were now a unit, sharing food, shelter, and responsibility for their children. Even this simple arrangement mattered enormously because it reduced competition and conflict within early human communities. If everyone understood who was paired with whom, there was less fighting over mates and more cooperation in raising the next generation. As human societies grew larger and more complex, something else started happening. Marriage stopped being just about two individuals and started becoming about entire families, and eventually entire communities. Once humans developed agriculture, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, everything changed. Suddenly, land, livestock, and stored food were valuable resources that could be owned, inherited, and fought over. And marriage became one of the most powerful tools humans had ever invented for managing that wealth. Think about it from the perspective of an early farming family. If your daughter marries into a neighboring family, you've just created an alliance. Maybe that means shared land, shared grain in a bad harvest year, or allies in a conflict with a rival group. Marriage wasn't about who you loved. It was about survival, strategy, and economics. This is why, across almost every ancient civilization we know of, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, early European tribes, marriages were arranged by parents or elders, not chosen freely by the couple themselves. Love, if it existed at all, was considered a bonus, not a requirement. This economic function of marriage gave rise to two of history's most fascinating, and sometimes controversial, traditions: the dowry and the bride price. In many ancient cultures, when a woman married, her family would give wealth, land, or goods to the new husband's family. This was the dowry, essentially a financial contribution meant to help establish the new household, and often to make a daughter more attractive as a marriage candidate in wealth-focused societies. In other cultures, the direction flowed the opposite way. The groom's family would pay the bride's family a bride price, compensating them for the loss of their daughter's labor and the children she would eventually contribute to the husband's family line. Some societies practiced both simultaneously. Either way, marriage in the ancient world often functioned less like a romantic milestone and more like an economic contract, because in a very real sense it was one. Now here's where things get architecturally interesting: the actual rituals. Why a ring? Why on that specific finger? The tradition of exchanging rings appears to trace back to ancient Egypt, where rings were seen as a perfect, unbroken circle, a symbol of eternity, with no beginning and no end. Egyptians would craft rings out of braided reeds or hemp, and later out of more durable materials like leather or ivory as the custom spread through wealthier classes. The ring wasn't just decorative. It represented an unbroken, eternal bond. The specific finger tradition, the fourth finger of the left hand, comes from an old and biologically incorrect, but historically persistent belief held by ancient Greeks and later adopted by Romans. They believed a vein ran directly from that finger straight to the heart. They even had a name for it, the vena amoris, Latin for vein of love. Even though we now know this isn't anatomically true, the tradition stuck, spreading through European customs and eventually becoming the standard in most Western wedding traditions today. What about the white wedding dress? This one is actually much more recent than people assume. For most of human history, brides simply wore their best clothing, regardless of color. Often deep reds, blues, or whatever fabric their family could afford. Since owning a dress meant for only one day was an incredible luxury few people could justify. The white dress as a specific symbol of purity and status became popularized largely because of one very famous wedding. Queen Victoria of England, who wore a white gown for her wedding in 1840. It wasn't a religious or traditional requirement at the time. It was actually seen as a bold, expensive fashion statement, since white fabric was notoriously difficult to keep clean and therefore signaled wealth. But because Victoria was so influential, and newspapers and portraits spread the image of her wedding widely, brides across Europe and eventually America began copying the trend. Within a few decades, white became the expected standard, and the original meaning shifted entirely into a symbol of purity and tradition, even though it started as something closer to a viral fashion trend. Then there's the veil, one of the oldest wedding traditions still practiced today, and one with a surprisingly practical, sometimes unsettling origin. In ancient Rome, brides wore veils believed to protect them from evil spirits who might be jealous of the couple's happiness and try to curse the union. In cultures practicing arranged marriage, the veil served an additional, more transactional purpose, hiding the bride's face until the ceremony was finalized, ensuring the groom couldn't back out of the arrangement upon seeing her for the first time. Uncomfortable as that origin might sound today, the veil eventually transformed into a softer, more romantic symbol, representing modesty, mystery, and the poetic, reveal moment we associate with weddings now. Let's talk about the aisle walk and the tradition of a father giving his daughter away. This custom is a direct, unmistakable relic of marriage's economic origins. In many historical societies, a daughter was legally considered property of her father until marriage, at which point ownership, yes, ownership, transferred to the husband. Walking the bride down the aisle and having her father formally hand her over to the groom was a literal transaction, a physical representation of property changing hands. Today, most couples who continue this tradition view it purely as a sentimental gesture, representing familial support and blessing, a beautiful modern reinterpretation of what was once a much colder legal formality. Now, what about the best man? This tradition has a genuinely wild origin story. In parts of ancient Northern Europe, particularly among early Germanic and Gothic tribes, marriage sometimes involved bride capture. Quite literally, a groom and his closest, strongest friend would kidnap a woman from a neighboring village or rival clan to marry her, especially if her family disapproved of the match or the two communities were hostile toward each other. The groom needed a companion strong and loyal enough to help him fend off the bride's family if they tried to intervene. Hence, the best man. As marriage customs became more consensual and formalized over centuries, this dramatic origin faded into what we now know as a purely ceremonial and celebratory role, though the name stuck around as a strange linguistic fossil of a much darker practice. Wedding cake, believe it or not, also has ancient roots. In ancient Rome, a loaf of bread was traditionally broken over the bride's head as a symbol of fertility and good fortune, with guests scrambling to collect the crumbs for good luck. Over centuries, this evolved through medieval Europe into stacked sweet buns, which guests would attempt to kiss over without knocking down, supposedly predicting future prosperity for the couple. Eventually, in the 1600s, a clever baker had the idea to combine these stacked treats with icing, creating something closer to the multi-tiered wedding cakes we recognize today. And what about throwing rice, or in modern times, flower petals or bubbles, at the newlyweds as they leave the ceremony? This tradition, found across many ancient cultures independently, symbolized fertility and abundance, a wish for the couple to have a prosperous, fruitful life together, quite literally showering them with the seeds of future prosperity. Rice specifically became common because it was widely available, inexpensive, and held deep cultural associations with fertility and sustenance in many agricultural societies across Europe and Asia. The honeymoon, too, carries a fascinating and slightly darker origin depending on which historical theory you subscribe to. One popular explanation traces back to ancient Norse and Germanic customs, where newlyweds would drink honey mead, a fermented honey-based alcoholic drink believed to boost fertility, for the first full lunar cycle, or moon, after their wedding. This gave us the phrase honeymoon quite literally. Another, somewhat darker theory suggests the term historically referred to the period immediately following a bride capture, when the groom would keep the bride hidden away from her family until she was, quote, moved on from attempting to escape or be rescued, until the next full moon passed and any search for her would have ended. Regardless of which theory holds more historical weight, the modern honeymoon has, thankfully, transformed into something far more pleasant, a celebratory vacation, rather than a tactic of isolation. By the time we reached the medieval period in Europe, the Catholic Church had inserted itself heavily into marriage customs, transforming what had largely been private family and community agreements into formal religious sacraments requiring church approval, priestly blessing, and adherence to specific religious vows. This shift gave the Church enormous social and political power, since marriage now required their explicit involvement and approval, and by extension, gave them significant influence over property inheritance, legitimacy of children, and family alliances across entire kingdoms. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, marriage customs developed along entirely different, equally fascinating paths. In many regions of India, elaborate multi-day wedding ceremonies developed, incorporating specific religious rituals meant to bind not just two individuals, but two entire families and their fortunes together, often guided by astrological compatibility between the couple determined well before the wedding itself. In China, ancient marriage customs included matchmakers who formally negotiated marriages between families, alongside elaborate gift exchanges symbolizing prosperity, and specific auspicious dates chosen through careful astrological calculation to maximize the couple's future fortune. In various African and indigenous cultures around the world, marriage ceremonies often incorporated communal celebrations lasting multiple days, symbolic exchanges of livestock or crafted goods representing the joining of families, and deeply spiritual elements connecting the couple's union to ancestral blessings and community identity. It's worth pointing out that for the vast majority of human history, right up until surprisingly recent centuries in most parts of the world, marrying purely for love was considered unusual, sometimes even reckless. Marriage was fundamentally viewed as an economic and social contract, a partnership meant to secure resources, alliances, legitimate heirs, and social stability. The romantic ideal of marrying your one true love, the person you're passionately drawn to above all economic or social considerations, is actually a relatively modern cultural shift, gaining real traction only over the past few centuries, heavily influenced by Enlightenment-era philosophy emphasizing individual choice and personal happiness, and later cemented by the rise of popular literature, and eventually film and media, romanticizing love-based marriage as the ultimate ideal. This shift changed everything about how modern weddings are structured and perceived. Where earlier marriages emphasized family blessing, economic security, and community approval above individual romantic feeling, the modern Western concept of marriage now centers almost entirely around the emotional bond between two people, their compatibility, their happiness, their personal choice to be together, independent of family arrangement or economic necessity, at least in an ideal sense. And yet, remarkably, so many of the specific rituals we still perform today, the ring, the veil, the aisle walk, the best man, the cake, the thrown rice, the honeymoon, remain almost entirely unchanged in their outward form, even as their underlying meaning has completely transformed. We've kept the shape of these ancient customs while quietly replacing their original, often far more practical or transactional purposes with softer, more romantic, more personal meanings that feel deeply modern, even though the rituals themselves are, in some cases, thousands of years old. It's a strange kind of cultural inheritance, really performing rituals whose original purpose has faded from memory, yet somehow still feeling deeply meaningful, deeply personal, deeply us every single time a couple walks down that aisle. Marriage, in that sense, isn't just a personal milestone. It's a living artifact, a tradition shaped and reshaped continuously by economics, religion, politics, and eventually love, carried forward, quietly generation after generation, long after most of us ever stopped to ask where any of it actually came from. So the next time you attend a wedding or plan your own, take a moment to notice just how much history is quietly sitting inside every single detail. The ring on the finger, the walk down the aisle, the cutting of the cake. None of it is random. All of it is ancient. And somehow, against all odds, it still means something deeply personal to every single couple who chooses to carry it forward.